Hey everybody, we are going forward in our book In the Spirit of the Earth. This book is by Calvin Luther Martin, and we are on page 43. Hunters, of course, move about the landscape, not randomly hoping to encounter something delicious, but in a directed and efficient manner. Hence, they put a premium on mobility. Historic and ethnographic sources confirm that infants and the very old and infirm could hinder that mobility. Yet, as real as such encumbrance might have been, it surely formed only part of the rationale for population control. In this, as in other matters, hunters, pragmatics, conform to a larger constitution of identities and protocols with the other intelligent things of one's environment and must be assessed within its terms. It is this larger image of living, of identity, and protocol with other life forms that I am trying to focus on and argue is exemplary from the hunter-gatherer realm. One can continue pondering the whys and wherefores of hunter population regulation, but for the moment it is sufficient to note that this stricture was jettisoned under the farming proposition. Farming societies are expansive in various senses of the word. Farmers create a margin, a food surplus. Hunters typically do not. Hunters characteristically have lived on the knife edge between starvation and substance, more accurately fasting and feasting. And herein is a lesson of major importance. Human engineered abundance with artificial storage on the one hand versus human forsworn or restrained abundance on the other. The former associated with the population spiral which remains with us still. The later characterized by systematic and rigorous methods of population control. We might now refine all of this a bit further. Earlier on, I remarked in passing that the emergency of the Neolithic was not an abrupt event. The transition from foraging to systematic farming being rather an incremental process in each of its various nurseries around the world. Scholars have puzzled and argued endlessly over the social, cultural nuts and bolts of the shift. My eye, on the other hand, is fixed on more thrilling, albeit ethereal fare. On the metaphysical plane, still certain nuts and bolts must be considered if we are going to get the metaphysical business straight. Consider the following scenarios with the melting of Pleistocene ice, regional climates gradually becoming warmer and wetter, and edible flora and fauna proliferated, except for the anomalous disappearance of certain big game. It was a potential free lunch that some groups simply could not resist. So the theory goes, with food so deliriously abundant, individuals helped themselves to more, and what they could not consume in the short run they stockpiled. Bear in mind that this is not yet farming, plant and animal domestication. It is hunters and gatherers hoarding food, the margin idea, and ominously lifting the lid off population controls. Population began to climb according to this hypothesis, and our hunters slipped from simple foraging into what is commonly called complex foraging, hoarding, in the jargon of population biologists, resource restraints were lifted by the invasion of a new behavioral niche, and reproductive rates consequently soared. Chances are this burgeoning population is beginning to march to the tune of social classes and heredity, prestige. For so the archaeological record suggests hither and yon in this age of post-Pleistocene largesse. What happens, however, when the free lunch ends? When, say, the climate turns from salubrious to hot and dry for a century or two, or even more, and the plants and animals one has come to rely on become frightfully scarce, and there is a sudden influx of immigrants into one's domain, where resources are already stretched thin, then the awful decision must be made either to go back, as it were, to the simple forager economy, or to press on through that ominous doorway into outright domestication, the Neolithic. This appears to have been the situation that confronted a number of complex foraging societies worldwide, several thousand years after the end of the Ice Age. A climatic or demographic crisis either drove them back into the secure austerities of simple hunting and gathering, or catapulted them into the Neolithic, that enchanted realm of sky gods, priest kings, and chosen people of history. My interest again lies exclusively in the metaphysical aspects of this process. In the heretical free lunch response to post-Pleistocene plenitude that in turn set the terms in, it would seem, for even more outlandish, literally otherworldly cast of the Neolithic mind. But was the free lunch idea truly heretical? Would it necessarily have been presumptuous for hunters and gatherers to harvest plants and animals, persons in greater abundance than these were seemingly in greater evidence? Not necessarily. This could conceivably have fueled literally a population bulge, creating a society that would have to make tough decisions when the ecosystem became stressed climatically or demographically, or both. The real issue, however, is hoarding, the stockpile of the edible portions of slain plants and animal beings. This is the heresy that would be compounded by the Neolithic commitment to artificially produce these plants and animals, stripping them of whatever remained of their spiritual volition, their permission, the gift, in the process. In the case of plants, it was probably more a matter of repositioning their spiritual virtue, which I prefer to call their grace, into the theater of the sky gods of weather and time, the keeper of agriculture. Let me acknowledge here that hunter societies have commonly stored certain foods gleaned from the wild, be it land or sea, in historic times. A comparison of the historical record with the more recent ethnographic reports of such storage gives the impression that it was always something engaged in with trepidation and a sense of risk, while at the same time it is a practice that has gained ground as traditional values have been either compromised or disowned. Even in today's apostatizing climate, the more potent animal beings almost never have their remains dried or put away. In this, as in all such complex issues of human behavior, the boundaries are never cleanly drawn, nor are they rigid. Since we see the roots of Neolithic mentality in complex foraging, the creation of a surplus social stratification, the beginnings of a population spiral, I shall, for the sake of convenience from here on, include this transitional phase from simple foraging to systematic farming within the metaphysical orbit of the later, referring to both merely as the Neolithic. Hoarding and population spiral joined to a profound realignment of social arrangements within the group seem to light the heart and the drift from simple foraging to relentless plant and animal domestication. We return again to the question, what on earth would possess Mesolithic hunters and gatherers to recast their image of themselves vice nature in such monstrous terms? Was it a species of greed, perhaps? Greed seems inherent in the free lunch slogan. I use the term because it is implied, if not frankly expressed in the mottos ecologists use to explain the evolutionary consequence of group selection versus individual selection. More jargon. Group selection operates when all members limit their population, called fitness, and hence the amount of resources used so that the group as a whole will not overtax its resources and thus may survive. Such a strategy of restraint is always invisible by an individual with a strategy of unrestrained reproduction. Before the resources for the group give out, this maverick will have contributed a disproportionate number of progeny to the group merely by reproducing faster. And one can continue playing out the consequences with the ultimate lessons being the good of the individual might contradict the good of the group. And insofar as the exploitative behavior of this individual is transmitted somehow to this numerically overwhelming offspring, the behavior of the group eventually takes on a similar cast of mind. It is Garrett Hardin's old tragedy of the commons idea, where some unscrupulous, selfish pastoralist decides to graze one or two more sheep on the commons than is customary. He gains personally, but in the end, such selfishness, if widely adopted, results in the destruction of the pasture, and then all suffer. But I am not moved by the greed argument, and I consider it largely irrelevant even in today's aggressive and competitive market economy. More fundamentally, I think the underlying motive for the abandonment of simple foraging was fear. As I brought over the metaphysics of Neolithic, I detect a language and artifice ridden by fear. Fear of not enough food, fear of animal elusiveness and hostility. Fear of our own death. I see none of these elements of fear disclosed in a voluminous literature, both historically and ethnographic, on hunter and gatherers, and that I think is revealing. Inherent in hunter-gatherer beliefs and performance is the notion that nature is a cornucopia, that nature will always supply one's needs, including sufficient food. Few of us appreciate this about the hunter-gatherer mentality. The popular image, even among many academics, so I have discovered from experience, though ethnologists know better, is of hunter-gatherer desperation over procuring enough to eat. The image is largely a fiction. It is part of a hunter's sense of caution and respect to speak modestly, even critically, of one's abilities in the chase or even to flatly announce failure. To acknowledge skill and success is tantamount to bragging, which is heard by listening game animals who would naturally take offense. Time and again, Europeans were told by a hunter that he and his little band had failed to secure any game in the previous weeks, which further inquiry, perhaps from another source, revealed that the man was basically lying. It is general rule among the traders not to believe the first story of an Indian. He will tell you on arriving that there's no deer and afterwards acknowledge them to be numerous, that he has been starving when he has been living in abundance. Was he deceiving to show his reverence to ubiquitous game spirits, and as well prompt his white listener to furnish him additional food? Quite possibly, Aboriginals the world over have habitually, steadfastly considered Europeans under obligation to furnish them with food, clothing, and hardware, quite simply because whites possess these items in seemingly unlimited quantity. Seeing that we are richer than they demand that we give them liberally whatever we have. And because whites typically declare themselves to be the Aboriginals' friends, by definition, shared wealth, an Aboriginal principle few whites grasp. And among those few were rarely embraced with enthusiasm. The other point is that hunter-gatherers fed themselves differently from, say, Westerners. Hunters both ate different fare and followed substantially different habitats of consumption, all of which was contributed to the fiction of hunter starvation. Hunters are notorious for eating things few Westerners would tolerate today, or in past centuries for the matter. Basically, if it yields calories and could be kept down, it was put in the pot. Mammalian innards, including gut contents, bone marrow, and blubber, or boiled whole fish scales and all, or insect larvae, menus of this sort revolted European guests who considered these diets marginal, not to mention barbaric. Nutritionally, however, meals involving these items made good sense. So too did boiling one's food rather than roasting or baking it. Hunters historically and ethnographically tended to consume their food as stews, in which the minerals and vitamins were retained rather than being lost in drippings or pouring off as waste. Thus, we witness a diet European observers oftentimes deemed unpalatable, unacceptable, while simultaneously we see the consumption of an extraordinary range of foods. Our modern diets are impoverished and unimaginative by comparison. As for eating behavior, here too we must recognize the key difference between Westerners and Aborigines. The latter have tended to follow a feast and famine regimen well suited, it turns out, to their physiological, well suited as well to the way nature presents herself seasonally and regionally for consumption. This is not the place to discuss hardcore human physiology, except to say that basically hunters practice lipid loading, fat loading, analogous to carbohydrate loading among marathon runners before the big race. When animal flesh is abundant and in anticipation of lean weeks ahead, say the transition from fall to winter, winter to spring, when ice freezes up or breaks up, makes mobility difficult for the northerly bands. Their bodies respond to slowly parceling out these fat reserves as energy over the days and weeks that follow. They diet themselves very thoroughly afterwards, living sometimes for about a week more or less on tobacco smoke and not returning to the hunt until they begin to be hungry. All of this I have developed in some detail elsewhere. What I wish to convey here is that it was Europeans who found themselves incapable of producing this metabolic feature. In short, hunting people typically are generally predisposed to be efficient food storers, chiefly as fat. Hinge eating, they stretch their bellies marvelously, followed by protracted food deprivation, should not be confused with gluttony, followed by tragedy, the erroneous conclusion drawn by many a white observer over the centuries. It is rather the way game presents itself in certain seasons of the year, a natural economy of nature to which the hunter's endocrine system is well adapted. Europeans living or traveling with the Aborigines on these occasions generally complained of starving, true enough for them, but not for their companions who were fasting. More to the point, their hosts were not complaining about the matter. They can abstain from food for many days together with a degree of indifference and good humor incredible to the European. They still consider nature to be generous and forthcoming in satisfying their needs not necessarily desires. There's a difference, and hunter-gatherers acknowledge and accept it. In this century, as ethnologists have attached themselves to hunting bands, they have frequently remarked on the natives' seemingly irrational confidence in the hunt, in nature's care. The amusing thing is that it was the ethnologists who were worried about possible failures, not the hunters. As we have seen elsewhere, game animals were not imagined as either elusive or hostile. They are more properly conceived and approached as friends who are willingly offer their fleshy coats to Homo, their ancient kinsman, as the latter has need of them. On the other hand, where hunter societies became compromised by European colonization or trade, we find this kind of confidence in short supply or even flatly rejected, in favor of reliance on what one might term metropolitan sources of food and other necessities. The other key fear that underlines the Neolithic mentality, as I see it, is of death, one's own mortality. Here once again, hunter societies stand in sharp contrast to our own and those of our Neolithic ancestors. Again, I am assuming that the equanimity that historic and modern hunters have shown when dying is but a continuation of an ancient, I suppose, essential Paleolithic trait. Just as whites have marveled at hunters' ability to withstand prolonged food deprivation, so have marveled at the ease with which hunters have lived this world, with as little struggle as they come into it. To put it succinctly, it was all right to die, as long as one died naturally on one's deathbed. It was not so fine to be killed in a battle by an enemy from another tribe or band. It was positively unacceptable to be felled by sorcery or murder from within or outside the group. Traditionally, one surviving kinsman sought revenge from unnatural death. The blood of the deceased was thought to cry out for. Another intolerable kind of death was that which came from mysterious epidemic disease, like that introduction of metropolitan civilization societies with their penchant for animal domestication urban congestion, and extensive trade networks, each an epidemiological disaster. Disease of this nature indicated something was dreadfully wrong with the cosmos, or that massive necromancy was abroad. Hunting-gathering people did not fret about an afterlife until Europeans brought them lurid tales of heaven and hell. Even then, we are amused to find one theologically skewed Indian and 17th century New France inquiring whether the Frenchman's heaven served those divine French pastries. For hunting people's attention was concentrated on the world and this life. An acceptable part of life was growing old and feeble and dying. Nature, the universe, was not damned for this economy of dying, not in speech or implicity in artifice. There were no elaborate efforts at preserving the human body from decay, for example, as with mummification in ancient Egypt or elsewhere. In death, the spirit decamped and functioned someplace else on the earth. The important point is that there was no anxious speculation about the nature of this place of the dead. It was considered natural and fine, was not to be feared, and in fact resembled the world and called forth the same mundane tasks which people knew while in the flesh, which is why the dead were buried in essential tools, jewelry and clothing, grave goods, ethnologists call them. My impression is that grave goods became much more common following contact with Europeans, say, or other exotic traders, perhaps because the spirit place was thought to lack these items. An interesting and provocative thought, but be that as it may, hunters never set for themselves the task of serving the circle of time, so palpably evident throughout creation, to fashion it instead into a vector that might hurl mankind out of earthly creation. Death was but a shedding of the fleshy apparel, a concept and phenomenon already familiar from the hunt. The spirit took up residence where all human spirits reside on earth, as one part of that larger, teeming commonwealth of spirit being that compose the essence, the chief reality of the earth. What am I driving at? That Neolithic societies had the temerity, and I suppose the courage, to forge into being orally and manually a seemingly unprecedented relationship with nature that was the product of some lesion of the imagination. As we reflect on that lesion, let it be asserted once again that there is no convincing archaeological, historical, or ethnographic evidence suggesting that pre-Neolithic Homo was somehow constitutionally driven to overwhelm and conquer nature. Plato's overkill would not contradict this incidentally, where the only thing lacking was the creative genius to figure out how precisely this might be technologically accomplished. That proposition or assumption, which has enjoyed a remarkable currency throughout Western history, may ring true theologically, but it is archaeological, historical, and ethnological fantasy. It is time to thoroughly disabuse ourselves of it. The Neolithic, I argue, was not a technological coup, a technological breakthrough, so much as it was a breakthrough more in the sense of rupture of the human imagination. From here on, human oral and manual discourse with nature would begin to take on an entirely new cast, with both these neuroanatomical powers now enlisted in the service of establishing Homo's primacy and mastery over nature. The essence of the Neolithic is cognitive, a revolution in perception and imagination. This is what I am suggesting. The mind that had fastened a check on Homo's rendering of nature in speech and artifice is now effectively removed it. Behold the narrative of mankind for the past 7,000 or so years, that is, since the dawn of Mesopotamian, Southeast Asian, Mesoamerican, and other civilizations, as one of exponential increasing technological and oral license. Somewhere in the garden of the Neolithic, alongside the tiny delicate ears of primitive maize, or the earliest domesticated old world grains, rice, and legumes, we ought to find as well the seeds of this tumorous unrestraint. I flatter myself that I have. It was when trust in nature turned to distrust, when Homo succumbed to the terror that nature would not furnish enough, and that we, alas, would die through her malice or alien ways. Alright, guys. That was the end of chapter 2, and next time we're moving on to chapter 3. Time was God. So, hope you enjoyed. I'm gonna get some sleep. Hey, we'll see you another time. All right. Good night. Bye. Go to bed.